Help became the Beatles' fifth studio album in August 1965. In the US, it became their eighth Capitol release in 19 months, and although sharing the same title as the UK album, its contents couldn't have been more different. I'm Andrew from Parlogram Auctions, and in this video I'm going to be taking a close look at the Capitol soundtrack album and find out why it's one of the most polarizing in the band's US catalogue. Let's start off this one with a quiz. What do you think was the top-selling album in the US in 1965? Was it Beatles 65? Beatles 6? Well then, it must have been Help. Well, actually, it was Mary Poppins. Soundtracks in the US in 1965 were big business. So much so that 5 out of the 9 #1 albums that year were soundtrack albums. Although not the biggest seller, the best of them for my money was Goldfinger. It's one of the best soundtracks of all time. A stonking title song backed up by John Barry's masterful orchestrations, which were bold, sexy, dramatic, orchestral, and a bit jazzy with a touch of camp. That soundtrack certainly influenced the incidental music in the film Help, and got Dave Dexter, the man in charge of the Beatles' output at Capitol, thinking about how he could make it all work for Capitol and the Beatles. Until that point, most pop soundtrack albums have been simple, jolly affairs. Cliff Richard's Summer Holiday or Wonderful Life have been huge successes in the UK, and soundtracks would dominate Elvis's output for almost a decade. In fact, his latest soundtrack from his film Roustabout had been 1965's first #1 album. One thing these soundtracks all had in common was that they included 12 to 14 songs, with performances featuring the artists themselves. Something which was not standard practice in grown-up soundtrack land, where they contained a high percentage of instrumental music. In the UK, the Beatles approached the Help album in the same way as they'd done A Hard Day's Night, i.e. an album on which all songs from the film would be on one side, leaving the other side to showcase other newly written songs. As with previous UK albums, this was terrific value, something which the Beatles were always keen to give their fans. So everyone was happy, right? Of course, it was a different story over the pond. With virtually free rein to do whatever they wanted with the Beatles catalogue, Capitol was more focused on making money than respecting the Beatles' artistic intentions, and saw Help as the perfect opportunity to cash in, big time. Regular imports of UK Beatles albums didn't start happening in the US until around 1968. So American fans had little or no idea what was going on in the UK release-wise. Unlike with A Hard Day's Night, Capitol now had the exclusive rights to all the Beatles recordings, and as a result were now able to put out an official soundtrack album themselves. Dexter immediately put all the songs on side 2 of the UK album aside for another day, and got to work concocting an album around the 7 songs from the film. In true film soundtrack tradition, he decided to pad out the album with some instrumental music from the film's soundtrack, which had been done with good effect with A Hard Day's Night. There was, and still is, a lot of love for George Martin's instrumentals on the A Hard Day's Night soundtrack, but in a dastardly move, later played down by Martin himself as pretty disappointing, the film's director, Richard Lester, froze him out and replaced him with jobbing film composer Ken Thorne. Thorne's most popular contribution to the album was his tribute to the James Bond riff, which was tacked on to the beginning of the song Help. This introduction became such an integral part of the song in the US, it was included on the 1962 to 1966 album 8 years later. In fact, it's still the version preferred by those who grew up with it. Although Thorne wrote the music for the film, it was Dexter who gave them their titles, such as From Me to You Fantasy, which were listed on the labels only. The inclusion of these instrumentals was seen by some as just a cynical, money-grabbing move by Capitol. But it also brings up another question. Why was Ken Thorne chosen over George Martin? It was no secret that Martin and Lester didn't get on. Both were highbrow controlling personalities used to getting their own way. Martin was a perfectionist in the studio, and Lester was the same on the film set. Victor Spinetti, for one, remembered Lester endlessly fussing about details on the Help set, spending an age over things like positioning cushions on sofas. Whereas George Martin had learned to tolerate and even develop an affection for pop music, Lester was strictly a classics man. How do I know that? Well, a few years ago I bought his record collection, and apart from a couple of Beatles LPs he'd obviously been given as freebies, his entire collection consisted of high-end classical music. He even had the odd habit of writing his name on the back of them. Pushed out by Lester and feeling under-rewarded at EMI, Martin responded by setting up his own independent company called Associated Independent Recording, otherwise known as AIR, in collaboration with his fellow EMI producers John Burgess, Ron Richards and Peter Sullivan. The idea was that AIR would fund the production of new releases, relieving record labels of the cost, and in return take a royalty on sales. In November 1965, still smarting from Lester's rejection, Martin released this album of recordings of his own instrumental arrangements of the film's songs, plus a couple of others from side 2 of the UK album. It was then oddly not issued on Parlophone, but on Columbia. Capitol had big ideas about the packaging of the Help album and promised fans a very special souvenir album. There was also something else special about it: the price. Traditionally, film and stage show soundtracks were bought mainly by a more mature, affluent audience, and thus were more expensive than pop albums. Capitol saw this as an opportunity to hike the price by a full $1 over other pop albums. So Help ended up being retailed at $4.98 for the mono and $5.98 for the stereo, which doesn't sound like much today, but $5 back in 1965 is the equivalent to an easy $40 now. But such was the popularity of the Beatles and demand for their records, the high price didn't have any effect on sales at all, which reached 1 million in 4 days. The US cover, with its terrific gatefold, was miles away from the original UK concept of the clean artistic image the Beatles originally approved, and it's certainly the most interesting aspect of this release. The only elements retained from the UK cover were the standing figures on the front, and even they were rearranged and made black and white. It must have been clear to anyone who was paying attention that Capitol were beginning to take too many liberties with the Beatles catalogue. There was even a memo issued at the time suggesting that in order to cash in on the success of the Yesterday single, Capitol could put together a Paul McCartney solo album. But even Capitol's management realised that this would be a step too far, and plans were quickly shelved. Even the Beatles themselves were at this point becoming more vocal about their unhappiness with Capitol's money-grabbing attitude. Never one to keep his opinion to himself, John Lennon expressed his displeasure with the album at a press conference at the Capitol Tower on August the 29th, just before they were presented with Gold Record Awards for this album by Capitol President Alan Livingston. Dexter was, at the insistence of EMI, relieved of his Beatles duties later that year, although not before he'd tweaked Rubber Soul into one of Capitol's best-loved albums, a video about which you can see elsewhere on this channel. Of course, I'm not going to leave this one without checking out the sound quality. The UK Help album has never been anyone's favourite sounding album, especially in mono. Its muddy, lifeless mix is only saved by Yesterday and Ticket to Ride, which are both masterful mono mixes. As I mentioned in my previous video about the early US albums, Capitol's attitude to tapes was disorganised and lazy. The US mono pressing manages to sound even worse than the UK. It's thin and weak and lacks any noticeable bass response on the Beatles tracks. Worse still, they are not even true mono mixes. Despite them being readily available, Capitol chose to use Type B, i.e. fold-downs of the stereo mixes for the mono release. This pressing also includes a strong candidate for the worst-sounding Beatles mix of all time, the mono Ticket to Ride. Capitol didn't have, or bother to get, a stereo mix of this track, and held only the mono single mix in their library. So for the stereo album, they created their own duophonic, i.e. fake, stereo mix. But in another example of their attitude towards their most important market, instead of then dropping the mono single tape into the mono album, they folded down the duophonic stereo mix back into mono and used that. So if you're thinking of getting this album on vinyl for the first time, take my advice and go for the stereo pressing and stay away from the mono. As far as the UK album is concerned, there isn't really a best mono version. They all sound pretty much the same. Whether it's the 1965 first pressing, the 1969 1 EMI box pressing, or the 1981 reissue. Your best bet is to get hold of the 2014 mono issue, where it sounds as good as it can on vinyl. The original UK stereo pressing isn't bad, but for better sound and value, I'd suggest either a 1970s 2 EMI box pressing or even one from Sweden, which used UK metalwork with -2, -1 stampers. Alternatively, you can't go wrong with the 1970s German pressing on Apple with an A2 B3 matrix. Me, well, as you might have guessed, I prefer the UK album. The cover is the only thing I really like about the US version. Anyway, do let us know in the comments what you think about this album and which one you prefer. The pictures in this cover remind me that Obertauern, the place where the ski scenes were shot, is just a couple of hours away from me here in Austria. So maybe this coming winter I'll be able to visit there and maybe make a video about the hotel where the Beatles stayed. Apparently you can even stay in any one of the 4 rooms the Beatles used when they stayed there. So stay tuned for that one somewhere down the line. In the meantime, if you enjoyed this one, please consider subscribing or even becoming a channel member. It really does help to keep all of this going. You can also find lots of great sounding Beatles vinyl on our website, parlogramauctions.com. There's still lots more to discuss about these records from all over the world, but that's all for this one, so I'll say bye for now and thanks for watching.